Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second part in our coronavirus history sit-down. Today, we'll be talking about the history of science and stories of excellence from the University of Pavia in the fight against diseases. Now, everything begins back in the 1760s when scientists all around the world were using microscopes to examine liquids that were full of organic substances. For example, water from ponds or broth used for cooking. Now, they could see that these liquids were they had thousands upon thousands of tiny moving particles. But why were they moving? Were they in some way alive? Well, right here at the University of Pavia, there was a truly great scientist. His name was Lazarus Spallanzani. He was famous at the time. He was a geologist, a chemist, and most importantly, he was a biologist. Well, in the 1760s, Spallanzani invented this brilliant experiment to find out more about these tiny moving particles in liquids full of organic substances. For his experiment, he used broth. Now, I'm guessing that it was a rich, meaty broth, just the kind that we use here in northern Italy for cooking ravioli or tortellini. Absolutely delicious. So what did he do with this wonderful broth? Well, he poured it into 4 different bottles. And he did different things with different bottles. He left one open, exposed to the air. Bottle number 2 was sealed shut. And bottle number 3 was boiled and then left open to the air, while bottle number 4 was boiled and then immediately sealed shut. Well, afterwards he looked for these moving objects in all of these bottles of broth. What did he find? Well, basically, all of them contained the tiny moving particles except for the last bottle, the one that was boiled and then immediately sealed shut. What was his explanation? That the microscopic objects moving in the liquid were in fact independent living organisms that had come into the broth from the outside air. In other words, they were tiny microscopic living creatures. And if you wanted to kill them, you could boil them. Now, this was exactly 100 years before the famous scientist Louis Pasteur did his work on killing microbes, leading to the process that we now call pasteurizing, which we use, for example, to make sure that milk is safe to drink and many other food products too. So here is the question. Why did it take so long to get from Spallanzani's experiments to Pasteur? Well, the history of science is also the history of society and how society evolves over time. Just as living beings change and evolve, just as viruses mutate, for example, and new viruses like COVID-19 come into existence, well, so too does society change and evolve. We've already said that ideas are like viruses. They propagate from people to people. But a virus can only live and propagate in the right kind of host. And it's the same for ideas. They're not able to propagate in a society that is not ready for them yet. We often speak about ideas being ahead of their time, don't we? Sometimes a genius has an idea that society cannot yet host, cannot yet propagate. Just think of Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines. They were hundreds of years ahead of their time. And actually, by the way, I will be talking about Leonardo da Vinci in the next episode too. Well, society in the 1760s just wasn't ready for Spallanzani's work. Society had to change. Generations of scientists all over the world had to slowly make new contributions. And perhaps most importantly, the general public had to slowly change its way of thinking as well. As you all know, given the circumstances today, nothing changes the way people think like an epidemic. And the 100 years between Spallanzani and Pasteur were full of terrible epidemics. But there are two in particular I want to tell you about. One of them, the first one, was not even an epidemic among humans. It was among animals, in particular silkworms. And this epidemic started right here in the north of Italy too. Well, this area where I live was in the past a major producer of silk. And it's no accident that all around Lombardy you can find lots of mulberry trees, because mulberry leaves are the favorite food of the silkworm. Well, in 1805, the silkworms of northern Italy started getting sick. The disease was called muscadine, and it was pretty horrible. You can see that. And there was this young man called Agostino Bassi who started investigating the epidemic. He was an entomologist. Well, it just happened that Agostino Bassi was a graduate of Pavia's University and a student of Lazarus Spallanzani's. Well, he found microscopic parasites infecting the sick silkworms. And most importantly of all, he found that they were transmitted by contact from one worm to another. After many years of research, because research is slow, hard work, in the 1840s, he proposed that diseases in humans, too, are transmitted by microscopic organisms. And this was the beginning of the germ theory of disease and disease transmission. So that's the first epidemic I wanted to tell you about. The second one actually happened in London in 1854, and it involved a man called John Snow. No, not that John Snow. This John Snow. He was a doctor, and he was working in London, and there was a cholera epidemic in 1854. Well, John Snow put two and two together. Spallanzani says that microbes can be killed by boiling. Agostino Bassi says that microbes spread disease. Well, maybe, he said, we should boil the water here in London before drinking it and before using it to wash. And so the fatality rate in that epidemic was drastically reduced. And when people saw this, it really helped change the mentality, change the way of thinking. It was another step in preparing society for the work of Louis Pasteur. So in this way, we can see how epidemics can, in spite of the negative consequences and the trauma, they can also bring about beneficial change. Well, society was now ready for Pasteur and his scientific research in the 1860s. Now, of course, the first thing that Pasteur did was to repeat Spallanzani's experiments and then develop them further. So, as we say in English, every cloud has a silver lining. Right, so here we are, in the middle of a global pandemic. And we can hope that society will evolve again, will change again. Actually, we must make sure that this change is beneficial. Certainly, if we look at how the scientists and the doctors here in Pavia at the university and the hospital of San Matteo are reacting to the crisis today with fresh research initiatives, we're not just talking about a history of excellence here. We're talking about a future of excellence too. So in our next episode, I want to talk about this work and the role of leadership. So there is a new kind of leadership today. Just as importantly, there is also something called followership. So if you follow me,